So Professor Conway is going to share with us today some reflections about the assembly that has taken place in Australia, which really is a model of the synodal process that Pope Francis is talking about. So I'm delighted you're here with us today, Eamon.
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you, and it's been a tremendous conference so far. So I hope some of this will be of interest to you. I think it's of particular interest to us, looking at it from an international perspective, as we have been here. And I've been privileged since I joined the staff in Notre Dame in October to hear a little bit about the Plenary Council that they have been undertaking from 2018 to 2022. Now, let me say this is not a normal presentation which I'm going to speak with you or to you for the next 15-20 minutes, because I wasn't at the Plenary Council. And so when I was reflecting on Gary's request to bring this to life for you, I felt the best thing I could do is actually record an interview with Archbishop Timothy Costelloe, who is the president of the Bishops' Conference in Australia. He was also the chair of the Plenary Council and led that process through. So we're going to watch a short video. It's only about 9 minutes, thanks to Bill and his team who edited it down from about a half an hour. We just recorded it last Wednesday, especially for this conference. But by way of introduction, let me just say a few words. The first is that the Plenary Council, as I say, took place between 2018 and 2022. The last Plenary Council, and there is a tradition of these in the Australian Church, took place back 80 years ago. So there was still a certain sense of the memory of a Plenary Council as a vehicle for bringing about change in the memory of the Australian Church. I suppose the other thing that's of note is that the Plenary Council, he will argue, will say, is it's clearly a very high-level form, if not the highest level of form, of a synodal process that can happen in a local church, which does produce some binding decrees. So when we finish listening to the video, I'll just come back in on that point. It took place over the period, as we say, 2018 to 2022, and had two plenary gatherings, two at times when there were actually gatherings, assemblies, a bit like Synod 21 to 24 is going to have, the first of which is in October. And at the second one, there were particularly tensions that sort of just raised a particular question around the role of women in the church. And we have one person, maybe there's more, but we have one person here in the room who was present at that Plenary Council. And I'm just going to invite Chris Lamb, who will be speaking to you afterwards anyway. But Chris is just going to address that particular question with us because he was actually there rather than hearing it secondhand from me. Is that okay? So we'll get moving on that. So I think we'll just watch the video. It's 9 minutes, so it's not too long. And thanks very much, Bill.
This week, we have tried to reimagine the church in Australia through a missionary lens, to dream of how we together can better witness to all that God has done and continues to do through the presence of the Lord Jesus among us as our way, our truth, and our life.
So just explain again why you decided to go down the road of a Plenary Council at that particular moment.
Look, I think it was because we realised that for this gathering of the whole church in Australia to have teeth, if you like, the Plenary Council would provide that because it's the highest form of gathering for a local church. It has legislative authority. It can make concrete decisions for the life of the church moving forward. And we felt that it provided us a structure that was already there in church tradition, which could help us. So I think we were very happy with that decision as the whole thing unfolded. So that was the decision. It was planned for 2020 and 2021. Then, of course, COVID intervened. And so it ended up being 2021, the first assembly online, which presented all sorts of challenges. And then the second assembly last year, face-to-face.
To what extent was it seen, Archbishop, as a response to the Royal Commission? Was it broader than that, or was that the driving element, would you say?
Yes, no, it wasn't the driving element, because as I explained, we had already decided long before the Royal Commission was called that we wanted to do something. Now, the decision to have a plenary council wasn't determined by the Royal Commission, but the reality of what has been unveiled tragically for us in Australia, by the Royal Commission, meant that it became a very, very significant factor in the unfolding of the Plenary Council. But the impulse was not just the Royal Commission, but of course the Royal Commission was preceded by a growing recognition over many years of the horrors of the sexual abuse crisis. So the issue was a big issue. The Royal Commission itself became a dominating factor in how we went forward.
What would you say were the greatest challenges that you faced?
I think they're very similar to the challenges that have emerged with the Synod as well. One of the challenges was to help everybody, and I mean everybody, from whether it's laity, clerics, religious, bishops, whoever we're talking about, help everyone in the church in Australia to understand what discernment is really all about. It's very easy, this was our experience anyway, to slip into a kind of a parliamentary mode where people had their point of view, they were going to argue for that, they would try and convince other people, then we'd take a vote and the majority would win. People just almost unconsciously move into that mode, and that's not the discernment mode that operates within the church. So that was a challenge. I'm not sure that we overcame it. In fact, I'm sure that we didn't overcome it completely. And I'd probably express it this way, Eamon, that when we started the process, we were formulating a question, a central question for the Plenary Council. And I remember being at the meeting in Brisbane. There were about 30 people, mostly lay people, but some priests and a couple of bishops as well, grappling with this issue of what will be the central question. And at the start of the 2 or 3 day, was like a retreat, the question was coming around, what are my hopes, what are my dreams for the church, what do I hope to achieve, all of those sorts of things. Perfectly legitimate questions. But over the couple of days, we began to realise that there was a significant element missing from the question, in a sense, at least explicitly, and that was God. So we eventually reframed the question, what do you, and the you could be you as an individual, you as a parish community, you as the church in Australia, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? That was an important thing, an important shift for us. But the challenge then was to help people understand that, at least in principle, what God wanted and what other people wanted may not necessarily be the same thing. It could well be, but to accept the possibility that no matter how passionately I feel about something, it may not necessarily be what God is calling the church to. That remained the challenge all the way through. In a simple way, I suppose, it was the challenge of helping people to let go of their agendas in order to be open to the work of the Spirit. So, yeah.
So looking back now as well at the period of the Plenary Council, what would you say have also been the greatest fruits?
Well, I think, having just said that we didn't succeed completely in shifting from what I want or what we want to a discernment about what God might be asking of us, I think we did make some significant progress in that. And I think one of the reasons for that was the adoption of what we called spiritual conversations as a methodology. I notice in the Synod now they've shifted from calling them spiritual conversations to conversations in the Spirit. Right. A bit of a subtle distinction, but it's a way of encountering each other in order to listen openly and respectfully and genuinely to each other, to hear what the other is really saying, to have the sense that people are also hearing what I'm really saying, and then to open up a discussion about, well, where do we find the Spirit of God at work in this? It's a very different model of encounter and engagement than people are used to. But it has emerged in Australia, and I noticed that it's emerging also at the universal level in the Synod as a fundamental gift of the Spirit to the church at this time. I've coined the phrase, it's all about non-defensive listening, which is how I explain it to myself. That when I listen to someone else within this context of a spiritual conversation or a conversation in the Spirit, I'm not listening to check whether or not they're smart enough to agree with me. I'm listening to truly hear what they are saying from their experience and from their heart. And I do that with each other person in the group that I'm in, listening deeply, not critically, openly, and with respect. And then together trying to say, well, from all of these voices that we're hearing, can we catch the voice of the Spirit here calling us forward? That the hope has been expressed in our plenary, following our plenary council, that this might become the way the church just operates at every level here in Australia in the future, at the level of the parish council, at the level of, I don't know, the council of priests, at the level of a diocesan pastoral council, whatever it might be, that this is the way we enter into dialogue with each other, truly listening to each other, in the belief that in the listening, we may be able to discern the voice of the Spirit. I'd say that's the single most important achievement of our plenary council.
You really anticipated my next question, because I think this spiritual conversation, this deep listening that you're speaking of, which is really essential to the leadership of the church, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Those who are in leadership positions like yourself as bishops or parish priests or whatever, we can't do our jobs unless we're actually engaged in that deep listening to the Spirit and the lives of every single member of the Christian community. Isn't that it?
Absolutely.
That we're not, we're rendered incapable actually of the leadership that is necessary at this point in time. Isn't that it?
I think one of the challenges for leaders in the church, whether it's bishops or it's priests or whether it's lay people who have often now very significant leadership roles in the church, is to resist that temptation of those of us who lead and who therefore get to direct everybody else, but rather to see leadership, and this is a bit of a cliche, but rather to see leadership as very deeply a ministry of service to the whole community. So we need to know our community and have listened to our community, being part of the community, not listening from outside, but listening from within, in order to understand where people are, to recognise the depth of their own experience and the sincerity of their own experience, in order to discern what the Spirit's asking of us. Now, the trick is to be able to listen and then discern. The discernment takes time, and I think this is one of the things that we struggle with a bit in the plenary council, and I think it's understandable. People want immediate answers and they want immediate results. And Pope Francis often makes this point when he's talking too. Sometimes it's just going to take a bit longer because we're not yet at a point where we can move forward together. And so, yes, some people want us to make a decision about this, that, or the other, and to move forward on that decision. But that will leave another whole group of people behind. So it's about creating a respectful listening and welcoming of each other in order to say, well, this is where we are. Where is God leading us? How are we going to get there?
Chris, would you just tell us a moment about what happened at the second assembly, which you were present? If you can just do that for us.
Okay, well, it was an assembly over 5 days in Sydney, and the delegates had to vote on a series of decrees or motions, and they were all gathered in the synodal form around tables, bishops, people together. And things were going fairly smoothly up until I think it was the third day when they had the motion on the role of women in the church. And it didn't seem to me a particularly controversial motion, but they had to get the support of the delegates, but also the bishops, and they didn't get enough support from the bishops for the motion on women, and that led to a crisis. And there was almost a walkout, and a kind of a protest was a kind of people made their feelings known in the room, and so the organisers went back to the drawing board, and they got together. Mark Coleridge, Archbishop, managed to sort of bring the thing together. I sort of wrote about it with the cricket analogy. It's like the first half of the team were bowled out, and then Mark Coleridge had to go in and kind of steady the batting and manage to get enough runs on the board to keep the show on the road. But it was remarkable that that it didn't break down. They actually trusted in the process. They continued to listen to each other, to dialogue, and they came up with a new motion, which was then agreed, and it included the question about the women's diaconate, because that was, I think, the contentious one. And they managed to get everything through. So it was quite remarkable, I think, because it showed that the process works. And it was interesting seeing the German synod, because there was a point in the German synod where a motion didn't go through, and I think people said, well, we're just going to implement it anyway. Whereas in Australia, they actually said, no, we're going to try and find a way forward. So that's what struck me powerfully following it. And all the decrees have been, I think, passed, and there's all sorts of things in there, and new things emerged as well around the liturgy, etc. The translation, which I think may have been a controversial issue here, the English translation, to call for to look at that again. Things have sort of emerged as well during the assembly. So yeah, I think what struck me was that this synodal process can work, but it is about taking a risk and stepping into the unknown.
Thank you very much, Chris. You have your own paper coming up in a moment, so you'll get a chance to take a breath. Thank you for that. So just so we can display the decrees there, Bill, for a moment. So there were a number of decrees issued at the end of it. And just, again, this is, I think, something to note, that these are meant to become local church law in Australia. And so already where I work in Notre Dame, we've been told as a Catholic agency that uses the term Catholic, we will be held accountable for how we implement these decrees, that we will be asked to give reports about how, as a Catholic university, we are taking these seriously. I don't know if they're big enough to read from where you're sitting. The first one is on healing wounds, receiving gifts. In particular, that is about, at the moment, reaching out to the Aboriginal communities, how the Church acts with justice towards those who have experienced systemic exploitation in society. Setting forth as missionary disciples, communion and grace, sacrament, being the church as a sacrament in the world, then the implementation of the whole area of repentance and seeking healing, witnessing to the equal dignity of women, formation and leadership for mission and ministry. And each of these decrees has an explanatory page and then a very sharp sentence that summarizes it. And they have now gone to Rome, and they're awaiting what's called a recognitio. They're awaiting formal approval from Pope Francis, which they believe won't be a big deal in coming. But also, for example, care of our common home, ecology, and so on is there as well. So that's the third phase then. So the first phase was the preparation. The second was the celebration, as they called it, which was that whole part of the two different plenary assemblies and so on, and now they're into the implementation phase. So they're that little bit further down the road than we are here in Ireland. So I think that's a way of just giving some sense of the plenary council process that took place in Australia. We've got a few moments for questions or comments, I think. Do you want to come in?
I think there are a few. I was in Australia to be the co-writer of this document, Light of the Southern Cross, and Massimo was also there. We were 3 people from outside, and I think this is very interesting that they already there said we are an island. We need to have people from outside so that we are not too closed in. Another point that I want to make is I was in 2016 in Australia when they had this idea of the plenary council, and then the question, so the Germans had not an officially existing canonical structure. The synodal part doesn't exist in canon law, and the Germans said we don't want a plenary council because of the composition, and because for a plenary council you have to submit your agenda to Rome to be approved, and the decisions have to be approved by Rome. So Archbishop Costelloe said to me, the problem is the composition, because in the Code of Canon Law there has to be a majority of clergy. And I then said to him, why don't you get a dispensation on the composition. And you ask, and we can easily build that argument with Vatican II. The church has changed, and there is a much many more professional laity working in the church. So they got the provision, and I think that was extremely helpful that they did get that. That was one thing. The other thing with regard to the difference, what Chris was just referring to, the difference between Germany and Australia when it all went wrong, the Australians had in the statutes, so if you're ever going to have something like this, they had in their statutes a provision, divine providence, a provision saying that if something had been voted on, it could be brought back on the agenda, because in many meetings, then that's it. But the provision in the statute said it could be brought back on the agenda provided something like 2/3 majority of the people present wanted to reopen the conversation. The Germans did not have that in their statutes. So you can see how important canon lawyers are.
A good plug. Just before throwing it open again to the floor, just a couple of points from my own experience, because that's really trying to report other people's experiences or record them. So I came out there in October to Australia. I had been back there a few years earlier for a semester. I've done a number of workshops with people on the ground in the Archdiocese of Perth at the request of what they call their Centre for Faith Engagement on synodality. And frankly, it's still Synodality 101. It's still, what is synodality? What do we mean by discernment? What do we mean by decision making? How do we work in a synodal church? How do we become an inclusive church? How do we get young people involved? Just in case we're creating the impression that they're way down the path, they will be the first to admit it. The Archdiocese of Perth, which is Archbishop Costelloe's own diocese, is now preparing to re-erect its diocesan pastoral council, which has not been functioning. And but this is the interesting thing. They're adopting a synodal process to establish the Diocesan Pastoral Council. So that's going to be a whole process, a wide assembly of people, out of which will emerge a Diocesan Pastoral Council, I think of 36 people, but they're involving hundreds of people in the planning stage and the discernment stage to form their pastoral council and the agenda of their Diocesan Pastoral Council. So it's still baby steps, I think, is really, even though they've gone down through the road of a plenary council. The second thing, because I raised this question with Myriam earlier about accountability, and I think this is a key point, and I put it to Archbishop Costelloe, how are you going to hold people to account for following through on the decrees? They're meant to be binding. So at the moment he indicated two areas. One is that there will be a round table in 5 years' time, which will have people who are a representative group of the various bodies that were consulted, to which they will have to report. And so that's, I suppose, informal, but nonetheless, it's some form of accountability. The other is that it's a standing item on the meeting of the Bishops' Conference, and the various subcommittees responsible for various areas must report into each Bishops' Conference on how the implementation of the decrees is progressing. So that's just, but I think that is a huge area. How do you actually evaluate it? How do you hold people accountable? Thank you.